Is there truly a deadly curse behind the theft of a rare diamond? It was a particularly quiet afternoon at the sprawling yet intimate residence of Hercule Poirot, nestled in the heart of London. The detective, seated by the window with his customary cup of tea, was enjoying the tranquility of the day when the unexpected sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. It was unlike any visitor to come knocking. There was a certain urgency in the ring. Hastings, ever the curious companion, answered the door, revealing a figure that both startled and intrigued him. Standing at the threshold was none other than Miss Mary Marvell, a dazzling star of the American silver screen. Her flawless beauty, which had earned her accolades in Hollywood, was now marred by an expression of deep distress. Her normally radiant face was pale, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she clutched a small, crumpled envelope in her gloved fingers. "Poirot," she began, her voice betraying a hint of desperation. "I need your help. I've received these letters, cryptic ones, and I don't know who to trust." Poirot, always a master at reading people, took one look at her and knew this was not a simple case of a worried woman seeking comfort. There was something deeper, something far more dangerous lurking beneath her glamorous exterior. "Come in, mademoiselle, come in," Poirot said, his voice calm yet firm, guiding her into his study where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. As Miss Marvell settled into the armchair, Poirot remained standing, watching her intently. She took a deep breath before speaking again, her eyes searching his face for any sign of judgment or disbelief. "I'm being threatened," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "These letters, they come from a man I've never met, a Chinese man, and they demand that I return something that I didn't even know I had." Poirot's interest peaked instantly, and he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "What is it that you must return, mademoiselle?" "The Western Star, a diamond," she replied, her hands trembling once more as she revealed a thin, weathered envelope from her bag. "It belonged to an idol, a sacred relic. The letters say I must return it to its rightful place before the next full moon, or else." Poirot's expression shifted, his lips curling into a slight frown. The words "rightful place" held a weight that immediately set his mind to work. "I do not know why this is happening to me, Poirot," she continued, her voice faltering. "My husband, Gregory Rolfe, he bought this diamond 3 years ago from a man he met in San Francisco. It was a gift, a symbol of our marriage. But now these letters, they're terrifying." Poirot's gaze softened, his sharp mind piecing together the fragments of information as they fell into place. The Western Star, a jewel of fabled history, said to have once belonged to a temple in China. But why had it come into her possession? And why was this stranger so adamant that she return it? "Tell me more about your husband, mademoiselle," Poirot asked, his voice calm, almost coaxing. "What do you know of his past?" Mary's face clouded momentarily, as though she was unsure of how much to reveal. "Gregory, he had dealings in the past, strange ones, his involvement with Lady Yardley. It's all tangled up in this. They say Lady Yardley's diamond, the Star of the East, also comes from the same idol. But why? I don't understand what it all means, Poirot." Poirot's mind raced. Connections were beginning to form, perhaps not just a jewel, but something far more sinister tied to the diamond's history. Was it a curse? Or was someone using this legend to manipulate the people involved? Before Poirot could ask another question, Miss Marvell paused and looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Poirot, I feel like I'm being watched. Even now, someone is in this room. I know it." Poirot rose from his chair and walked over to the window, peering out into the fog that had begun to settle in the street below. A flicker of movement caught his eye. The shadow of a figure, slipping between the alleyways, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. A chill ran down Poirot's spine. It was not merely a case of a stolen diamond or a frightened woman. This was something much larger, an intricate puzzle, wrapped in mystery, steeped in danger. "I will help you, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice steady but firm. "But you must promise me one thing. Do not trust anyone who offers you easy answers." The room seemed to grow colder as Miss Marvell nodded, her fear palpable. But as she stood to leave, she hesitated, turning back to Poirot. "One more thing, Poirot," she said, her voice barely audible. "The letters, they say that the full moon is coming soon, and after that, someone will die. Cliffhanger ending." With that, she was gone, disappearing into the fog that had descended upon the city. Poirot remained standing by the window, his mind racing. This was no ordinary case. The stakes were higher than he had anticipated. There was a deeper game being played here, one he had yet to fully comprehend. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly in the silence of the room. Poirot's mind was already working, his brilliant mind piecing together the clues. But the question remained, who would be the first to die? The past connection. The dim light of the study flickered as Poirot sat in his armchair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood of his desk. Miss Marvell, her face pale from the distress of the situation, sat opposite him, her eyes clouded with confusion and fear. The silence between them was thick, charged with the tension of unspoken truths. Poirot's mind was already at work, his sharp instincts piecing together the fragile pieces of the puzzle that had been laid before him. He waited, watching Mary, as she collected her thoughts, preparing to reveal more of the mystery. "It was 3 years ago," Mary began, her voice trembling slightly, as though the weight of the words was too much for her to bear. "Gregory, my husband. He bought the diamond from a Chinese man in San Francisco. He told me it was a rare jewel, something that had been passed down through generations. He gave it to me as a gift, one of the many extravagant gestures that I've come to expect from him." Poirot's brow furrowed as he leaned forward, his interest piqued. He had suspected as much from the start. It was no ordinary jewel, no mere trinket. The Western Star was a relic, its history far older and more dangerous than a simple wedding gift. "And this diamond, what do you know of its origins?" Poirot asked, his voice measured, yet carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Mary's eyes flitted nervously to the window, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. She hesitated before answering, as if unsure how much she should reveal. Finally, with a deep breath, she spoke. "It's part of something much larger than just a piece of jewelry," she said quietly. "It was once part of a sacred idol, stolen from a temple in China. The legend goes that the idol was broken into pieces, scattered across the world. This diamond, the Western Star, it was one of the stolen pieces." Poirot's gaze sharpened, his mind racing. A stolen idol, its pieces scattered across the globe. It was an ancient legend, but one that carried weight. The diamond, so valuable, so coveted, was this truly just a series of coincidences, or was there something much darker at play? "Monday Dieu," Poirot muttered under his breath, leaning back in his chair as his mind worked through the implications of her words. A sacred idol, and a stolen jewel. But there is more to this story, n'est-ce pas? Why, I wonder, did your husband come into possession of such a treasure? And why now are these threats beginning? Mary looked down at her hands, her fingers still twisting nervously. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. Gregory never spoke of it in detail. He always dismissed it as a curious artifact, nothing more. But after receiving the letters, I can't shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong. Poirot's gaze never wavered from her face, his mind already running through the possibilities. The missing pieces, the strange occurrences, and now this Mary's husband, Gregory Rolfe, a man with a secret past, a man who had clearly been involved with the diamond in some way. Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed as he recalled a gossip he had overheard months ago, something that had been whispered in the corridors of high society. "You mentioned Gregory's past involvement with Lady Yardley," Poirot said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge. "It is a curious connection. You see, Lady Yardley possesses a diamond of her own, the Star of the East. There are rumors that it came from the very same idol." Mary's eyes widened, and her breath caught in her throat. She had known the Yardleys, knew them well enough to be aware of the scandal surrounding the family. But to hear Poirot speak of the diamond in such a way sent a fresh wave of panic through her. "The Star of the East," Mary repeated, her voice trembling. "But that's impossible. Gregory never mentioned Lady Yardley's diamond. Why would he have been involved with her? What does this mean? Poirot's eyes glinted with understanding as he observed her reaction. He could see that the revelation had shaken her to her core. It was clear now there was more to Gregory Rolfe's connection to Lady Yardley than Mary realized. The plot was thickening, and the lines between friend and foe were becoming dangerously blurred. "Perhaps, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice taking on a more contemplative tone. "It is not just about the diamond, but about the power it represents, and the lengths to which some will go to possess it." As Poirot pondered this new information, the room seemed to grow colder, as though the shadows themselves were conspiring to obscure the truth. He could feel that there was something hidden beneath the surface of this case, a dark secret that had yet to reveal itself. Mary stood up abruptly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though she were trying to steady herself. "Poirot, what are you saying? Are you telling me that my husband is involved in something criminal?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed as he thought of the tangled web of deceit and greed that had already begun to reveal itself. He knew the answer, of course, but he needed to be certain before he spoke it aloud. There was no turning back once the truth was spoken. "Let us say, mademoiselle, that your husband is not the man you think him to be," Poirot replied, his voice low, measured, and chilling in its certainty. A long silence filled the room, and Mary's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one far darker than she could have ever imagined. And then, just as she was about to speak, there came a knock at the door. A sharp, deliberate knock that echoed through the study. Poirot stood up, his expression unreadable. He turned to Mary, his voice calm yet foreboding. "Whatever happens next, mademoiselle, you must be prepared for the truth to be more terrifying than you could have ever imagined." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot opened the door, his eyes locked onto the shadowed figure standing in the doorway. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and then, as the door creaked open, a figure stepped forward, holding something in their hand, a small, carefully wrapped bundle. Poirot's face remained impassive, but his mind raced. This was no ordinary visitor, and this was no ordinary moment. The air in the room thickened with tension, and Mary took an instinctive step backward, her face pale with apprehension. The visitor spoke, their voice cold and measured. "I believe this belongs to you, Miss Marvell." In their hand, they held a small box. The diamond was inside. The full moon was coming, the clock was ticking, and the game had just begun. The first theft. The drive to Yardley Chase was an uneasy one, the landscape slipping by in muted shades of gray as the fog rolled in thicker with each passing mile. Poirot and Hastings sat in a silence that seemed to envelop them, both of them weighed down by the mystery that had already begun to take root in their minds. Miss Marvell had been deeply disturbed, and it was clear that the situation surrounding the two diamonds, the Western Star and the Star of the East, was far from ordinary. Something darker, something more dangerous, lurked beneath the surface. Poirot, ever the observer, was not one to dismiss coincidences, and as he surveyed the thickening mist, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were headed straight into the heart of the storm. Hastings, ever the skeptic but increasingly intrigued, glanced at Poirot, who seemed lost in thought, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his seat. "I've always said, Hastings, that a great deal can be revealed in the quiet moments, when the eyes do not look directly," Poirot murmured, his gaze fixed outside the window. "One must listen to what is not said, as much as to what is." Hastings gave a non-committal grunt, not entirely understanding the meaning behind Poirot's cryptic words. He was more concerned about the mystery unfolding. But that was the nature of their partnership, wasn't it? Poirot's mind worked in ways that were often beyond Hastings' grasp, and yet it was the detective's uncanny ability to unravel complex puzzles that kept Hastings at his side. As they approached Yardley Chase, the imposing silhouette of the mansion loomed through the fog like a ghost. It was a grand structure, with ivy creeping up its stone walls, its windows dark and uninviting. The atmosphere surrounding it seemed heavy, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Monday due, we arrive at last," Poirot said softly, as though speaking to the mansion itself. And already, I feel that there is more to this place than meets the eye. That night, as Poirot and Hastings settled in the drawing room, the guests were gathering for an evening of quiet conversation. Lady Yardley, a woman of striking beauty with an air of elegance that seemed almost unnatural, stood by the fire, her fingers gently caressing the Star of the East, the diamond that had become a centerpiece of her family's legacy. Mary, too, was in attendance, her face drawn with worry, though she tried to appear at ease. The evening proceeded uneventfully, with light laughter and gentle clinking of glasses, until the lights suddenly flickered and then went out entirely. A gasp rippled through the room, and a momentary unease settled over the gathering. Poirot, who had been observing the guests carefully, remained still, his sharp eyes catching every subtle movement in the room. The flickering shadows danced across the walls, creating a sense of disquiet. "It seems the electricity is not quite cooperating," Hastings commented, his voice carrying the slightest edge of unease. "I do not believe this is a simple electrical failure, mon ami," Poirot murmured, his eyes narrowing. "A very convenient timing for such an occurrence, non?" Before Hastings could reply, there was a sudden cry from Lady Yardley. The sound was shrill, filled with terror. Poirot was on his feet in an instant, his eyes darting to the source of the scream. He moved swiftly toward the sound, and as he passed through the corridor, the dim glow of a nearby candle illuminated the silhouette of a Chinese man, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Poirot's heart raced with the sudden realization, but before he could move, the figure lunged forward. Lady Yardley, who had been standing near the mantelpiece, screamed again as the man's hand shot out and snatched the diamond from around her neck. The Chinese man, moving with a fluidity that was almost unnatural, vanished into the shadows before anyone could react. The lights flickered back on, and the room erupted into chaos. Lady Yardley clutched at her neck, where the diamond had been, her face a mixture of disbelief and horror. Poirot's eyes scanned the room quickly. There was no sign of the thief. He had disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. Hastings rushed to Lady Yardley's side, trying to comfort her, but Poirot was already moving. He looked around, searching for something, anything, that might explain what had just transpired. "The diamond," Poirot muttered under his breath. "Gone. But why? Why here? And why now?" But before he could form a clearer picture, another scream shattered the air. This time, it came from Mary. She was standing in the hallway, her hands trembling as she looked down at the empty space where her own diamond, the Western Star, had once been. It was gone. The next morning, Poirot and Hastings stood in the garden, the fog lifting slightly but still clinging to the mansion's looming presence. Lady Yardley, her face pale and her eyes red from crying, had given a full account of the events, but there was still much that did not make sense. The Chinese man, how had he gained access to the house? And why target both diamonds, the ones with such a strange connection? Poirot paced back and forth, his mind working at a frenetic pace, piecing together the facts. The thefts were no coincidence, that much was certain. But there was a deeper connection here, something far more complex than a mere robbery. "Monday, ami," Poirot said, turning to Hastings. "It is evident that we are dealing with something far more sinister than a thief who simply wishes to steal jewels. This is a carefully orchestrated plot, one that involves far more than just the diamonds themselves." "But Poirot, how can you be sure?" Hastings asked, still struggling to grasp the full scope of the mystery. "The connections," Poirot replied softly, almost to himself. "The Chinese man, the legends surrounding these jewels, the involvement of Lady Yardley and Miss Marvell, and the timing of everything. I suspect, Hastings, that these diamonds are not merely objects of value. They are pieces in a much larger game that is still unfolding." Cliffhanger ending. Just as Poirot and Hastings were about to leave for the library to examine the clues further, a figure appeared at the gate. A man, hurried and disheveled, walking with purpose towards them. He was breathing heavily, his face pale with urgency. "I've come from London," the man said, his voice frantic. I've discovered something. Something about the diamonds. Poirot's eyes sharpened, his instincts immediately on high alert. The man stepped closer, holding a crumpled envelope in his hand. "It's about the Star of the East," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "It's not just a diamond, it's a key to something far more dangerous." As the man thrust the envelope into Poirot's hands, the sky darkened, the wind picking up once more. Poirot's fingers tightened around the envelope, but before he could open it, a shadow moved in the distance. The game was far from over. The revelation. The evening was quiet at Yardley Chase, the calm before the storm. Poirot sat in the study, an almost impenetrable silence hanging in the air as he sifted through the scattered papers before him. Each new piece of evidence led him deeper into the web of deceit that had been spun around the two diamonds, the Western Star and the Star of the East. He had known from the very beginning that something was amiss. But now, as he pieced the puzzle together, he realized the enormity of the lie that had been crafted to deceive them all. Hastings, ever the inquisitive companion, stood by the door, his hands folded across his chest as he watched Poirot's every move. The detective's brow furrowed, his fingers tapping on the desk, as he stared at the two photographs before him, one of the Western Star and the other of Lady Yardley's Star of the East. His mind racing to fit the final pieces into the puzzle. "Hastings, there is a terrible deception at play," Poirot said quietly, his voice laced with disbelief. "I have thought long on the matter, and I have come to an undeniable conclusion. There were never two identical diamonds." Hastings' brow furrowed. "What do you mean, Poirot?" Poirot stood abruptly, his sharp gaze meeting Hastings' eyes with a piercing intensity. "I mean, mon ami, that Gregory Rolfe, the man who brought the Western Star to Miss Marvell as a wedding gift, was no mere collector of jewels. He was a man who lived by deception, a man who knew that the only way to secure his future was to exploit the trust of others. It was Rolfe, Hastings, who orchestrated the thefts and fabricated the story of two identical diamonds." Hastings' face twisted in confusion. But the diamonds, the connection to Lady Yardley. "The Star of the East was never meant to be part of this twisted tale," Poirot interjected. "Lady Yardley's diamond was a separate entity entirely. A jewel passed down through generations, valuable not only in its rarity, but in its history. But Gregory Rolfe, with his eyes fixed on that very gem, had a different plan." Poirot's mind flashed back to the earlier conversations, the whispered rumors, the tension between Lady Yardley and Mary, the strange behavior of Gregory Rolfe. He recalled Mary's unease when discussing her husband's past, and the strange coincidence that the Western Star had come into her life just when she was most vulnerable. "It was Rolfe who blackmailed Lady Yardley," Poirot continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "He knew the value of the Star of the East, and he had learned of its significance to the Yardley family. He forced Lady Yardley into giving him the jewel, under threat of exposing a dark secret she had spent years burying." Hastings' eyes widened. He blackmailed her. But how? Poirot's gaze drifted to the fire flickering in the hearth, the dancing flames reflecting the intense focus in his eyes. Lady Yardley had a past, Hastings a past she would have preferred to keep hidden. There were whispers, rumors about her involvement in a scandal years ago. Rolfe, a man of great cunning, learned of it and used it to his advantage. He demanded the diamond from her, threatening to reveal the truth unless she complied. Poirot paused, his fingers interlacing as he continued. But Lady Yardley did not give the diamond willingly. She was forced into it, but not before Gregory Rolfe devised a plan to cover his tracks. He fabricated the myth of two identical diamonds. He convinced the world and, most importantly, Miss Marvell, that the two jewels were part of a matching set, that the Western Star was somehow the twin to Lady Yardley's Star of the East. It was all a lie, Hastings, a lie designed to distract attention from his own crime. The revelation hit Hastings like a physical blow. The notion that Rolfe had been playing such a dangerous game, manipulating those around him with such skill, was almost beyond belief. But Poirot, ever the calm, calculating genius, had no doubt in his mind. "But Poirot," Hastings asked, the wheels turning in his mind. What about the thefts? The Chinese man who attacked Lady Yardley and Miss Marvell. How do they fit into all this? Poirot turned to him slowly, a glimmer of something cold in his eyes. That, mon ami, is the final twist in this twisted tale. Poirot sat back in his chair, his mind weaving through the latest development. The thefts, the attacks, the sudden disappearance of the jewels, they were all distractions. Rolfe knew that if the truth came to light, if Lady Yardley's involvement in the theft of the Star of the East was exposed, it would ruin her. But he also knew that the only way to cover his tracks was to make it appear as though the jewels were being stolen one by one. He planted the idea of a mysterious thief, someone from the Far East, behind it all. It was his way of deflecting suspicion, of making the entire world believe in a much larger conspiracy. Hastings shook his head in disbelief. So the Chinese man, he was never after the diamonds? Exactly, Poirot replied. He was a pawn in Rolfe's game, a tool used to divert attention. Rolfe orchestrated the thefts, hired the man to create the illusion of a larger conspiracy. But in reality, the man had no interest in the jewels. It was Rolfe who took them both. Poirot stood and walked over to the window, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the last traces of the day's light were fading. "And now, Hastings," he said softly, "we are left with a puzzle that will lead us to one final confrontation. A confrontation with a man whose greed knows no bounds, and whose web of lies will soon unravel." Hastings, still processing the revelation, took a step forward. "So, we confront Rolfe?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, but not yet. The final piece is yet to be placed. We must wait for the right moment. The game, as it were, is not yet over." Cliffhanger ending. Just as Poirot turned to speak once more, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The door creaked open, and in walked a familiar figure, Lady Yardley. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I've come to you, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered urgently. "There's something you must know. Something I never told you before." Poirot's gaze hardened, his instincts kicking in. "What is it, Lady Yardley?" She stepped forward, clutching something tightly in her hand, a small worn letter. "It's from Gregory Rolfe. He's coming for the Star of the East. And he's not alone." Poirot's eyes flashed with understanding, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "He is preparing for something far more dangerous than I had imagined." As Lady Yardley placed the letter in his hand, Poirot's gaze hardened. "We must act quickly, Hastings. The final game has begun." And with that, the door slammed shut behind them, leaving a sense of foreboding that would linger long into the night. The final resolution. The tension in the air was palpable as Poirot, ever the master of quiet authority, stood in the heart of Yardley Chase's grand drawing room. The room, usually filled with light and warmth, now felt cold and empty, as if the very walls were holding their breath, awaiting the inevitable confrontation. Gregory Rolfe, his face as impassive as ever, stood by the window, his back to Poirot. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, yet Rolfe showed no sign of fear, only a cold, detached calmness, as though he had already won the game. But Poirot knew better. He always did. With a deliberate step, Poirot turned to face Rolfe, his eyes narrowing. "Monsieur Rolfe," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of undeniable certainty. "You have lived a life of deceit and manipulation, and now the time has come for you to face the consequences." Rolfe turned slowly, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You're too late, Poirot. The game is over, and there's nothing you can do to change what has already been set in motion." Poirot's gaze remained steady. "Ah, but you see, monsieur, the game is never truly over. It simply changes its course, and I have always been one step ahead of you." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Rolfe's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he regained his composure. "And what do you think you can accomplish now? I have the diamond. I have everything I need. What will you do, Poirot? What will you do to stop me?" Poirot stepped closer, his eyes locking with Rolfe's, piercing through the mask of arrogance that the man wore so well. "I will do what I do best, Monsieur Rolfe. I will use the truth against you." You think you have played the perfect hand, but I have already seen through your every move. Rolf's face tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. You think you know everything, don't you? You think you have it all figured out. Poirot nodded, his voice soft but sharp, like the edge of a blade. Yes, I do. You thought you could manipulate Lady Yardley. You thought you could manipulate Miss Marvell. You played them like pawns in your little game. But there is one thing you forgot. Monsieur Rolf, the truth always finds its way to the surface. The silence was heavy as Rolf took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door, as if contemplating escape. But Poirot's gaze held him in place, the weight of his deduction too powerful to ignore. You see, Rolf, Poirot continued, his voice never rising above a calm whisper, you believed that the Western Star was your way to wealth and power. But you failed to consider one thing: the Star of the East was never yours to claim. You blackmailed Lady Yardley into giving it to you, and then you used that as leverage to deceive Miss Marvell. But there was always something you missed, something you failed to account for. Rolf's face darkened as he stepped forward, his eyes burning with rage. What do you mean? What did I miss? Poirot raised a finger, his expression unwavering. You missed the one thing that would always expose you the truth behind your own lies. You have been running from your past, running from your own crimes. But you can't outrun the consequences, Rolf. The game is up. For a moment there was a quiet stillness, as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Then, with a sudden fluid motion, Poirot reached into his coat and pulled out a small, delicate object, a diamond. The Star of the East. Rolf's eyes widened in shock. He took a step back, his face suddenly pale. How did you? Poirot smiled, a cold, knowing smile. The truth, monsieur, is not as elusive as you believe. You thought you had concealed it well, but it was always there, hiding in plain sight. This diamond, which you believed would be your undoing, has now become your downfall. Rolf's eyes flicked toward the door again, panic beginning to set in. But Poirot was ready. He had anticipated this reaction, and he was not about to let Rolf slip away. Rolf, Poirot said, his voice colder now, it is over. The Western Star and the Star of the East, they are both part of a legacy that cannot be destroyed by the likes of you. You have stolen them both, yes, but the truth is a force far more powerful than any jewel. Rolf's face twisted with rage and desperation. You think you've won, Poirot, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. I'll never go back to the life I had before. I won't let you ruin everything I've worked for. Poirot's gaze softened, just slightly. I do not seek to ruin you, monsieur. That, I believe, is something you have already done to yourself. You think you've won, Poirot, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. I'll never go back to the life I had before. I won't let you ruin everything I've worked for. Poirot's gaze softened, just slightly. I do not seek to ruin you, monsieur. That, I believe, is something you have already done to yourself. Rolf took a sudden, wild step toward Poirot, but before he could make another move, Hastings appeared at the door, his hand gripping the handle. Poirot, he said in a low voice, the police are here. It's over. Rolf froze, his eyes darting toward the door, then back to Poirot. In that moment, it was clear to him that there was no escape, no further deception. He had been outwitted, outplayed, and now his past sins had come back to claim him. Poirot turned to Lady Yardley and Mary, who had been watching the scene unfold in the doorway. With a calm gesture, he handed the diamond to Lady Yardley. Monsieur Rolf has made his choice. But you, madame, will return the Star of the East to its rightful place, where it belongs. Lady Yardley nodded, her face a mix of relief and sorrow, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Thank you, Poirot. I am forever in your debt. Poirot bowed his head slightly. It was nothing, madame. Just the work of a small gray cell. The police entered, and with one final glance toward Gregory Rolfe, who now stood in defeat, Poirot turned away, his mind already racing with the details of the case. The mystery was solved, but the satisfaction of solving it was a fleeting one. There was always another case, always another puzzle to be pieced together. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot made his way to the door, his hand hovering over the handle, A chilling thought crossed his mind that sent a shiver down his spine. Behind him, Lady Yardley's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Poirot, there's something you should know. Something I should have told you earlier." Poirot turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What is it, madame?" Lady Yardley hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. "I found something in the safe, a letter from Gregory Rolfe. It wasn't just about the diamonds." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. What was in the letter? Lady Yardley handed him the letter, her hand shaking. Poirot unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. His breath caught in his throat as he read the final line. "Poirot, you may have won this round, but there is another diamond done that has yet to be found, and it will be yours to find should you dare." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Poirot standing there, the weight of the letter in his hands, and the unsettling realization that this case was far from over. Conclusion. The case was over. Gregory Rolfe, the mastermind behind the thefts, had been taken away, the diamonds returned to their rightful owners, and justice, in its own peculiar way, had been served. But as Poirot stood by the grand window of Yardley Chase, gazing out at the twilight sky, there was no sense of triumph in his posture. Instead, an air of contemplation hung around him, like a fine mist settling over the hills in the distance. Hastings stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back, his usual good-natured expression replaced by one of quiet reflection. They had solved the mystery, certainly, but something about it lingered, as though the pieces of the puzzle had been snapped into place too easily. Poirot, his brow furrowed, slowly turned to face his old friend. "Hastings," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "do you ever wonder why people are so quick to cling to superstition, to the belief that life is governed by strange forces beyond our control? Why, instead of facing the simple truths that lie in front of them, they prefer to weave stories of magic, of curses, of unseen powers?" Hastings, always the more straightforward of the two, looked puzzled, but also intrigued. "Well, Poirot, I suppose it's easier, isn't it? It's simpler to think that something bigger than us is at work. The unknown is often less frightening than the truth, which sometimes can be harsh and unsettling." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Yes, Hastings, you are correct, of course. But what people fail to realize is that in the pursuit of these grand, mysterious tales, they overlook the most significant aspect of all their own nature. Human beings are far more complex, far more driven by their own desires and faults than any ghost or curse could ever be. In the end, the truth is often nothing more than a reflection of our own actions, our own weaknesses." There was a brief silence as Poirot's words sank in. Hastings, for once, had no witty retort. He had come to respect Poirot's way of thinking, his ability to see past the distractions, the dramas, and to arrive at the simplest, clearest conclusion. But even Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. "You're saying," Hastings began slowly, "that the entire mystery was really just about people's greed, their own ambitions." Poirot's gaze darkened slightly, and his eyes narrowed as though he was staring into the very heart of the mystery. "Yes, Hastings, Gregory Rolfe was driven by something far more human than magic or myth. It was his greed, his desire for power, and the fear of being exposed for his past sins. But this is not the only reason why people cling to superstitions." Poirot paused, looking at the window as though something unseen beckoned him. Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Poirot exhaled softly, his voice barely a whisper now, as though speaking the words aloud might summon some dangerous force. "When one is confronted with their own faults, their own sins, they often retreat into the comfort of the fantastical. They would rather believe in the supernatural than face the painful reality of their actions. The truth, Hastings, is too unbearable for many to accept." He turned to his friend then, his expression grave. "But what if, in some cases, the truth we uncover is only a small part of a much larger, much darker story? What if the mysteries we solve are only stepping stones to something far more sinister, something we've yet to uncover?" Hastings looked taken aback, his brow furrowing. Poirot, surely you don't mean. Poirot raised his hand, cutting him off gently. It is not yet clear, mon ami. But sometimes when one mystery is solved, it opens the door to another. We see the surface, but beneath it, the deeper currents of human nature pull at us, unseen. Hastings felt a chill run down his spine. He had been with Poirot long enough to know that this was no idle comment. There was something in Poirot's voice, something that hinted at more than just an idle reflection on human nature. "You think there's more to this?" Hastings asked, his voice thick with concern. Poirot's eyes sparkled with that familiar intensity. "I do not know, Hastings, but I do believe we are standing on the edge of something, a new puzzle perhaps, a shadow cast by the mysteries we have yet to solve." Hastings felt his pulse quicken, an unease gnawing at him. He had seen Poirot face down killers, con men, and criminals of all sorts, but this was different. There was a quiet urgency in his words now, something that felt both thrilling and unsettling. Poirot turned back to the window, his posture stiffening slightly, as if an invisible presence lingered in the room with them. "The human mind is a labyrinth, Hastings, and we have only begun to scratch the surface. We may solve this case, but we will never truly escape the mysteries that it unveils. Perhaps it is the mystery itself that draws us in." Hastings stood still, his mind racing with the implications of Poirot's words. Was there another mystery? Had they solved this one only to find themselves stumbling into a far darker web? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the room, and Poirot's eyes flicked toward the door. He said nothing, but there was a flash of recognition in his eyes, as if he knew something was about to happen, something that would change everything. A knock on the door interrupted the moment. Poirot's eyes narrowed, a small, knowing smile forming on his lips. "Monday, ami," he said softly. "It seems we are not done with this mystery after all." The door creaked open, and the figure of Lady Yardley appeared, holding a letter in her trembling hands. She stepped forward, her expression strained with urgency. "Poirot," she said, her voice cracking, "I've just received this. It's for you." Poirot took the letter from her hand with a measured, steady grace. As he unfolded it and read the contents, his eyes darkened. His fingers clenched around the paper as the words written inside made his heart skip a beat. "Another mystery, Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice colder than usual. "Another mystery, far more dangerous than the one we've just solved." Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's gaze lifted from the letter. His eyes shadowed with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through Hastings. "Hastings," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "This case is not yet finished. What I feared, it is true. The game is far from over." As Lady Yardley stood there, her eyes wide with confusion and concern, the sound of a distant clock striking midnight echoed through the estate. The air grew colder, and Poirot turned to face the open window once more, as if sensing something just beyond the horizon. Hastings looked at him, his heart pounding. "Poirot, what is it? What does it say?" Poirot's lips curled into a grim smile, his voice low and foreboding. "It says that the Western Star was not the only jewel of its kind. There is another. And it is hidden somewhere very close to us. The hunt, Hastings. The hunt has only just begun." The room fell into an eerie silence, and the door behind them creaked shut, the soft whisper of something far darker, lurking just beyond their grasp.